I'll never forget that Wednesday morning when my entire world turned upside down. My name is Margaret Hayes, and at 53 years old, I thought I'd seen everything life could throw at me. I was wrong. The alarm went off at 5 a.m., just like it had every workday for the past 4 years. My body protested as I pushed myself out of bed, my lower back aching with that dull, persistent pain I'd learned to ignore. At my age, getting up this early wasn't easy, but I had no choice. Bills don't pay themselves, and I had a family to support. "Mom, you're up!" I knocked softly on my mother-in-law's bedroom door. "Yes, dear," came Ruth's raspy voice from inside. "Off to work again today?" "Yes, I've got a new house to clean in Riverside. I left your medications on the kitchen table. Please take them after breakfast." I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my graying hair. The reflection staring back at me looked so different from 5 years ago. After my husband David's death, white streaks had rapidly taken over my brown hair, and deep lines had etched themselves around my eyes. 53 years old. I'd once been called the prettiest wife in the neighborhood, but now my face carried the weight of every sleepless night, every tear shed, every burden carried alone. Should have skipped the mirror, I muttered to myself with a bitter smile. My footsteps felt heavy as I headed to the kitchen. Our small apartment was manageable, but the monthly mortgage and utility bills weighed on me constantly. When David died suddenly in that car accident, the insurance money helped for a while, but it wasn't nearly enough to support Ruth and our daughter Emily through college. I poured myself coffee and mentally reviewed the day's schedule. 9 a.m. at Mrs. Peterson's house in downtown, 2 p.m. at Dr. Morrison's place in the suburbs, and finally, 5 p.m. at a new client's home in Riverside. 3 houses in one day was exhausting. By the end of each shift, my whole body ached and my hands reeked of cleaning chemicals. "Margaret, don't push yourself too hard," Ruth said, shuffling into the kitchen. "Your back was hurting yesterday." I forced a smile. "I'm fine, Ruth. I can handle it." She gently squeezed my shoulder. "You work so hard. If David were still here." Her words pierced my heart. 5 years had passed, but my husband's absence remained a gaping hole in our lives. It hurt most when Ruth missed her son like this. I quickly finished breakfast and got ready. Standing at the front door, putting on my shoes, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. Neatly tied hair, minimal makeup, and my clean housekeeper's uniform. This was the reality of Margaret Hayes. At 53, living without her husband. After finishing the exhausting work at the first 2 houses, I arrived at my final job of the day in Riverside. Standing in front of the upscale apartment complex, I double-checked the note from the cleaning agency Floor 32, Unit 32201, Mr. Stephen Morrison. I informed the security guard in the lobby, received my visitor's pass, and took the elevator up. As it climbed to the 32nd floor, I straightened my appearance in the mirrored walls. The elevator doors opened, and I walked down the corridor. Standing in front of Unit 32201, I took a moment to catch my breath and pressed the doorbell. "First impressions matter, Margaret," I reminded myself. New clients always made me nervous, but after 4 years in this business, I developed my own approach to handling them. The doorbell chimed, and moments later, the door slowly opened. I'd prepared a polite greeting, but the words froze in my throat. Time seemed to stop. The man standing before me was David Hayes, my husband, who had died in an accident 5 years ago. "This can't be," I whispered, doubting my own eyes. The man looked different, with a long beard and glasses, but those eyes, that face, it was definitely David. A trembling voice escaped my lips. "David? All color drained from the man's face. His eyes widened in shock. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly. The tension between us was almost tangible. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. In those brief seconds, countless emotions crashed through me. Confusion, shock, joy, and rage all mixed together. My mind went blank like a white page, then filled with thousands of questions. How is he alive? Why didn't he come back to us? Where has he been for 5 years? My legs gave out. I collapsed against the doorframe, struggling to breathe. My heart raced so fast it hurt, and my vision began to blur. Just as I thought I might pass out, the man rushed toward me. Margaret. His voice was low and shaking. It was unmistakably David's voice. Tears streamed down my face. I looked at him carefully, every detail of his face. David, I said with certainty. It was my husband. After crossing 5 years of separation, we stood face to face. Suddenly, David tensed at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. His eyes sharpened, his body shifting into a defensive stance. He quickly scanned the surroundings. You can't be here, David said urgently. He grabbed my arm and quickly pulled me inside. As the door closed, he peered out once more, checking the hallway. Only after securing all the locks did David allow himself a brief sigh of relief. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, still in shock. Tears continued streaming down my face, and my whole body trembled. David approached me, then stopped. He could read the complex emotions radiating from my eyes. Not simple joy at our reunion, but a mixture of 5 years' worth of betrayal, confusion, and anger. How could you? I finally managed to speak, my voice shaking. Does your mother know? Does Emily? Am I the only one who didn't know? My voice carried 5 years of longing mixed with deep betrayal. I remembered all those nights spent crying, trying to accept his death, comforting Ruth and Emily while hiding my own grief. Nobody knows, David answered, his voice heavy with guilt. I never expected you to come here. I never expected us to meet like this. Suddenly, rage surged through me. I approached David and shoved his chest hard. How could you do this? Do you know how hard it's been for us? Do you know how much Emily missed her father? My voice grew louder. 5 years of suppressed emotions were exploding. David accepted my anger without any defense. He simply bowed his head, watching as my emotions poured out like a storm. I thought you were dead, I sobbed. Just hearing your name tore my heart apart. David took a deep breath and cautiously approached me. He tried to take my arm, but I instinctively pulled away. Calm down, Margaret. I'll explain everything, David said, his eyes pleading. We need to go back to the day before I died. I need to tell you the truth about why I'm living like this. And then David began revealing the shocking story, piece by piece. As the truth unfolded, my head spun, and I felt myself beginning to lose consciousness under the weight of it all. If you're finding this story compelling, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to you. The story began in February 2019 at the research laboratories of Morrison Pharmaceuticals, one of the nation's leading drug companies. It was past 11 p.m. when David Hayes, a research scientist at Morrison Pharmaceuticals, sat alone in the laboratory, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his computer screen. He was reviewing clinical data for Cardistop, the company's new heart medication that had recently launched to great acclaim and boosted the company's stock price significantly. This is strange, David muttered, reviewing one particular document for the third time. It was a graph showing liver enzyme levels in patients taking Cardistop. The liver values showed a steep upward trend after starting the medication a dangerous pattern. "This is serious," David said with conviction. After decades in pharmaceutical research, he knew exactly what this data meant. Cartostop was causing severe liver damage. "I need to report this to Mitchell tomorrow morning," he decided. Frank Mitchell was his direct supervisor and head of clinical data analysis. The next morning at 9 a.m., David spread out his overnight research across Frank's desk, watching for his reaction. "What are you talking about, David?" Frank frowned, flipping through the report. "Frank, I thoroughly verified the data last night. Cartostop is causing much more severe liver damage than anticipated. If we continue selling it—" "Wait!" Frank raised his hand, cutting David off. "This isn't statistically significant." David was stunned. He'd spent all night analyzing the data, and the results were clear. "But Frank, the numbers are too obvious to ignore." Frank sighed heavily. "David, do you know how much the company has invested in this? Hundreds of millions of dollars. We can't just pull the plug because of some preliminary findings. People's lives are at risk," David emphasized. Frank's expression hardened. "Dr. Hayes, I understand your passion, but this isn't a decision you or I can make alone. Let's just move on for now." But Frank, David tried to argue. "The discussion is over." Frank's tone was final. After the meeting, David returned to his desk, his mind in turmoil. Frank's response had been colder than expected. He couldn't just let this go. David decided to bypass Frank and report directly to Dr. Robert Hutchinson, the research director. Dr. Hutchinson had been his mentor for years and led Morrison Pharmaceuticals' research division. Surely he would understand and support him. After lunch, David went to Dr. Hutchinson's office. The director welcomed him warmly. "David, come in. What can I do for you?" David sat down and calmly explained his findings. Dr. Hutchinson listened quietly, then carefully examined the report. His expression grew increasingly serious. "Have you reported this to anyone else?" the director asked. "Yes, I reported it to Frank Mitchell, but he said to let it go." Dr. Hutchinson let out a deep sigh. "Let me look into this personally. Thank you for bringing it to my attention." David left the office feeling relieved. He trusted Dr. Hutchinson would make the right decision. The next morning, David's office phone rang. When he picked up, Dr. Hutchinson's heavy voice came through. "David, please come to the conference room on the 15th floor of the main building at 2 p.m. today. There's a meeting with the executive team." David's heart raced. "What kind of meeting, sir?" After a brief silence, Dr. Hutchinson replied quietly, "It's about Cartostop." After the call ended, David took a deep breath. Having the issue discussed at the executive level could be a good sign. He hurriedly prepared all his research data and reports. At 1:55, David arrived outside the 15th floor. This floor was normally off-limits to researchers. It was reserved for executives only. With nervous hands, he straightened his tie and knocked on the conference room door. "Come in!" a voice called from inside. He opened the door to find several people already seated in the spacious room. David recognized Richard Parker, the CEO Jennifer Walsh, the COO Thomas Wright from the legal team, and Dr. Hutchinson. All wore serious expressions as they watched him enter. "Have a seat," CEO Parker gestured. David sat down, noticing a copy of his report lying on the table in front of him. "Dr. Hayes," Parker began. He was a charismatic man in his late 50s, a medical school graduate who had switched to the business side early in his career. "We've all reviewed your report. Quite shocking content." David nodded. "Yes, sir. Cartostop is causing more severe liver damage than anticipated. I believe immediate action is necessary." Parker slowly flipped through the papers. So what do you want us to do? Pull the drug from the market? That would be the safest course of action, David replied. COO Walsh shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Hayes, do you understand how important this drug is to the company? Of course, David answered. But patient safety is more important, isn't it? Parker suddenly laughed, but there was no warmth in it. Dr. Hayes, you're remarkably naive. This drug accounts for 40% of our revenue. If it's recalled, the company goes under. Do you understand what that means? David swallowed hard at the CEO's changed demeanor. Even so, he carefully continued. People's lives are at risk. Dr. Hayes, Parker's tone sharpened. Cartostop has improved the lives of thousands of heart disease patients. Are you suggesting we abandon all those people who need this medication because of a few side effects? David wanted to argue, but Parker continued. Besides, the data you've brought isn't conclusive enough. We need more verification. Isn't that right, Dr. Hutchinson? All eyes turned to Dr. Hutchinson. David desperately hoped his mentor would speak the truth. Well, as Mr. Parker says, additional research is probably necessary, Dr. Hutchinson said, without looking at David. David felt utterly betrayed. Legal counsel right cleared his throat. Furthermore, if this report leaked externally, we'd face not only a stock collapse, but also class action lawsuits. The company's very existence is at stake. David felt increasingly isolated. Dr. Hayes, Parker suddenly spoke in a softer voice. I admire your passion and conscience. Those are qualities of a good researcher. The truth is, we're not trying to completely ignore this issue. We were planning additional research anyway. How about you lead that research? We'll promote you to senior research scientist and significantly increase your research budget. David's eyes widened. Senior research scientist was a position he'd dreamed of for years. The salary increase would be substantial, and he wouldn't have to worry about Emily's college tuition anymore. Of course, let's not make this public right now. Once we have sufficient data, we'll take appropriate action, Parker suggested with a knowing look. A silence fell as David wrestled with his thoughts. He'd wanted that senior position for so long, and it would be great for his family. But, I'm sorry, Mr. Parker, David said with a resolute expression. Human lives are at stake. I can't sell my conscience. We need to warn medical professionals immediately and recall the drug if necessary. The air in the conference room froze. Parker's expression slowly transformed. The warmth disappeared, replaced by cold fury. David Hayes. Parker dropped all formality. Do you understand what you're saying? Your career ends here. I can have you completely blacklisted in this industry. David tried not to show how frightened he was. At his age, finding a new job wouldn't be easy. My decision stands, he said, steadying his shaking voice. Parker stared at him for a moment, then suddenly smiled a smile that sent chills down David's spine. You live at 300 Willow Drive, apartment 2B, don't you? With your wife and mother? Parker said slowly. David's face went pale. And your mother takes diabetes medication, Parker continued. And your daughter Emily is a sophomore in college. Such a dedicated student. She walks home the same route every evening at 6 o'clock. It's dangerous for a young woman to be out alone that late, don't you think? David couldn't breathe. Terror and rage mixed in his chest. He could endure threats against himself, but he couldn't risk his family's safety. My family has nothing to do with this, David said, his voice trembling. Exactly. So make the smart choice. I'm more dangerous than you think. Parker's response was ice cold. What we discussed in this room stays in this room. You go back to work as usual and forget this happened. Understand? David couldn't speak. He looked at Dr. Hutchinson, but his mentor kept his head down, clearly unwilling to help. "Now go back to work," Parker ordered. "Oh, and starting tomorrow, you're off the car-to-stop project." The meeting was over. David dragged his heavy legs out of the conference room. In the hallway, he had to lean against the wall. His legs were shaking too much to walk. "How can this be happening?" he muttered. That evening, David came home later than usual. He'd wandered the streets for hours, and by the time he regained awareness, it was already dark. As he entered the apartment, Margaret greeted him with a worried expression. "You're home late. You didn't answer your phone." "I was worried." David forced a smile. "Sorry." The meeting ran long. Margaret noticed her husband's pale face and grew more concerned. "Is something wrong? You don't look well." "No, just tired." That night, David couldn't sleep. Should he give in to the threats? Or should he continue fighting to expose the truth? Watching Margaret sleep peacefully beside him, David's heart ached. He couldn't put his family in danger, but he also couldn't ignore the fact that countless people were suffering because of car-to-stop. He quietly got out of bed and went to his study. Opening his laptop, he sent an email to an old friend, journalist Michael Torres, who worked for a medical journal. "Mike, urgent matter. Let's meet tomorrow." David hit send and let out a deep sigh. He'd just started crossing a river from which there was no return. He didn't know what awaited him, but he was certain he was doing the right thing. The next morning, a message came from Michael. "Let's meet for lunch near downtown. The Oak Tree Cafe." As soon as David got to work, he copied all the data about car-to-stop's side effects onto a USB drive and left to meet Michael. When David arrived at the cafe, Michael was already sitting in a corner booth. He was a well-groomed man in his early 40s who had been David's close friend since college. "David, long time no see." Michael stood to greet him. They shook hands and sat down. "Sorry for the sudden contact yesterday," David said. "No problem. I was curious what was so urgent." Michael's expression was serious. David glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Mike, I need your help." "What's going on?" David took a deep breath and explained everything that had happened over the past few days. Car-to-stop's serious side effects, the company's cover-up attempts, and even the threats against his family. He laid it all out honestly. Michael's expression grew increasingly grave. "So you want to blow the whistle?" "Yes. This isn't just about company secrets. People's lives are at stake." David pulled the USB drive from his pocket and handed it to Michael. "All the evidence is here." Michael took the drive and looked at it for a moment, then looked up at David. "This won't be easy. You'll lose your job and things could get much worse." "Are you sure about this?" "I know," David acknowledged. "But I think about what Emily will know when she grows up. What choice would I want her father to have made? I want to be a husband and father they can be proud of." Michael put the USB in his bag. "All right. I'll work on this." "Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate it." As David left the cafe, he felt genuine hope for the first time in days. He returned to work and finished his remaining tasks. All he could do now was wait for Michael's article. The next morning, David arrived at work earlier than usual. He hadn't slept well, waiting to hear from Michael. But his phone remained silent. Around 10 a.m., his office door suddenly opened. Thomas Wright from Legal, accompanied by 2 security personnel, entered. "Dr. Hayes, you need to come with us." Wright's voice was cold and official. David was confused. "What's this about?" "Mr. Parker has requested a meeting." "Right now." David's heart sank. What had happened? He rode the elevator to the executive floor with the three men. The security guards flanked him like he was a criminal. When the door to Parker's office opened, David faced a shocking scene. On Parker's desk sat the very USB drive he'd given to Michael. And even more shocking, Michael was sitting next to Parker. "Come in, Dr. Hayes," Parker said with a cynical smile. David slowly entered the office. His eyes went to Michael, but Michael avoided his gaze. "Surprised?" Parker asked. "Didn't expect your friend to betray you, did you?" This is the power of Morrison Pharmaceuticals. David was speechless. His mind reeled in confusion, his chest filled with betrayal. "Mike!" he finally managed to say. Michael finally looked at David, but his eyes held more coldness than remorse. "Sorry, David. I've been connected with Morrison Pharmaceuticals for 2 years now." David felt like collapsing. His friend since college, the person he'd trusted most, had betrayed him. "Amazing, isn't it?" Parker continued. "I have people everywhere." David trembled with rage and despair. "You people know people are being hurt, and you still—" "It's business, Dr. Hayes," Parker replied coldly. "Sometimes sacrifices are necessary, and it's your turn to be that sacrifice. You're fired, effective immediately. Pack your things." David had expected those words, but hearing them still felt like his world was collapsing. Sudden termination made his future completely uncertain. And, Parker tapped his fingers on the desk, "we're suing you for $10 million for NDA violations." David's face went white. $10 million, an amount he could never pay. "That's illegal," David protested. "Then we'll see you in court. Want to find out how strong our legal team is?" Parker smiled coldly. Wright handed David a stack of papers. Termination notice and confidentiality agreement reaffirmation. "Sign them." David's hands trembled. He realized he'd been completely defeated. The evidence was gone, his friend had betrayed him, and now he'd lost his job. "Leave the building within 30 minutes, Parker ordered. David took one last look at Michael. The face of the friend he'd trusted most now looked like a stranger's. "I hope you don't become their victim too, Mike," David said as his parting words. He left the office and headed to his workspace. Security followed him. When he arrived, his colleagues all seemed to avoid him. The rumors had already spread. David packed his personal belongings into a box. 20 years of his career ending like this, he still couldn't believe it was real. When David arrived home, he stood in front of the door for a long time. How could he explain this to Margaret? What should he say? He was deeply conflicted. Parker's threats echoed in his mind. The fear of his family being in danger crushed him. David didn't want to tell Margaret the whole truth and watch his family live in terror or pain. Finally making his decision, David took a deep breath and opened the door. "Honey, you're home?" Margaret's voice called from the kitchen. "Yeah, I'm home." Margaret came out of the kitchen to greet her husband, but her smile faded when she saw his grim expression. "Is something wrong? You don't look well." David sat on the living room couch, trying to maintain his composure. "Margaret, sit down. I need to tell you something." Margaret sat beside her husband with an anxious expression. "What is it? Tell me." David was silent for a moment, then began. "I'm taking a break from work for a while." "Taking a break? What do you mean?" Margaret's eyes widened. David couldn't look his wife in the eye. He lowered his gaze and said, "The research project was suddenly discontinued, so I need to take some time off." Margaret didn't immediately understand what her husband meant. "You were laid off?" "No, not like that." David continued the lie. "It's like a company restructuring. During this break, I'll still get partial pay. Don't worry." Margaret still looked doubtful, but didn't press further. After more than 20 years of marriage, she could tell when her husband was hiding something, but she decided to wait until he was ready to share. Okay, whatever it is, we'll get through it together. She squeezed David's hand. I'll make dinner. After Margaret returned to the kitchen, David let out a deep sigh. Lying to her was painful, but he convinced himself it was the only way to protect her and their family. Over the next few days, David pretended to be resting while secretly searching for other options. Somehow, he had to expose Morrison Pharmaceuticals' wrongdoing and find his place again. David contacted several news outlets while Margaret was out shopping, but most responses were cold. I'm sorry, but without concrete evidence, we can't report such serious allegations, one reporter said. We also have to be careful about stories targeting companies like Morrison Pharmaceuticals. Bring us solid documentation and we'll reconsider. Another outlet responded. David felt defeated. He had no evidence left in his hands, but an even greater trial was approaching. His calls to various media outlets about Morrison Pharmaceuticals' misdeeds had already reached CEO Parker's ears. In his home office, Parker was talking with his assistant, James Bradford. So David Hayes is calling news outlets? Parker said, swirling his whiskey. Yes, sir. He hasn't given up yet, Bradford replied. Parker's expression darkened. We have no choice, then. Ordered David Hayes killed. Make it look like an accident. Bradford's expression hardened, but he nodded. Understood, sir. Make sure it's done right. As long as he's alive, our company remains at risk. Bradford responded without emotion. Understood. I'll prepare immediately. One day, David's cell phone rang. He cautiously answered. Hello? Dr. Hayes, this is James Bradford from Central News. I received your tip about Cartostop and wanted to reach out. David tensed. Finally, someone was willing to listen. Could we meet to discuss this? Would you be available this evening? When can we meet? David asked. How about 7 p.m. at the Riverside Cafe near Pinewood Park? I'll be there at 7. After hanging up, David felt a glimmer of hope. He'd finally made progress. Honey, I'm going out for a bit, David called to Margaret, who was preparing dinner in the kitchen. Margaret looked at her husband with concern. Without eating dinner? Where are you going? Meeting an old colleague. We're having dinner together, catching up. All right. Don't be too late. David gave his wife a brief hug and left the apartment. He started his car and exited the apartment complex. Evening traffic in the city was heavy with commuters. He drove toward Pinewood Park. After about 20 minutes of driving, David noticed a black sedan in his rearview mirror. The car seemed to follow every turn he made. At first, he thought it was coincidence. But after the third direction change and the car still behind him, David began to feel uneasy. I'm being followed, he realized, his heart racing. David suddenly changed direction and turned into a small side street. As expected, the black sedan followed him down the alley. Now he was certain. It's a trap. Seized by fear, David accelerated. Instead of heading to Pinewood Park, he drove in a different direction. Only one thought consumed his mind-escape. Entering the highway, David increased his speed. Checking his rearview mirror, he saw not just the black sedan, but another vehicle, a gray SUV, pursuing him. David was terrified. He pressed harder on the accelerator, trying to lose the cars following him. But they closed the distance. Soon, the surroundings had transformed into a desolate mountain road with deep ravines on both sides. Suddenly, the gray SUV pulled up alongside his car. David swerved to avoid collision, but at that moment, the black sedan rammed him from behind. David's car skidded toward the guardrail. He desperately turned the wheel, but the black sedan hit him hard again from behind. This time, the car completely lost control. "No!" David's scream filled the car. His vehicle broke through the guardrail and began plummeting toward the ravine below. Time seemed to slow down. David felt his life flash before his eyes, meeting Margaret, Emily's birth, happy family moments. "I can't die yet." In that moment, suspended in the falling car, David instinctively unbuckled his seatbelt. As the car hit the first boulder and the impact flung the door open, he threw himself out with all his strength. Sharp pain shot through his entire body, but he fought desperately to stay conscious. Meanwhile, his car continued falling down the ravine. When it reached the bottom, it exploded in a massive fireball, black smoke rising into the night sky. Up on the mountain road, 2 cars had stopped. People got out and looked down at the ravine. After confirming the burning vehicle, they exchanged satisfied looks and words. Shortly after, both cars left the scene. The next morning, police contacted Margaret. David's car had plunged off a mountain road and caught fire. "The vehicle was severely damaged, and we haven't found any remains at the scene," the officer said carefully. "But given the severity of the crash and fire, the likelihood of survival is—" Margaret couldn't hear anymore. Her world collapsed. She sank to the floor sobbing, and Emily rushed to support her. A week later, David's funeral was held. They'd searched for a body for 7 days, but found nothing. So the funeral proceeded without remains. Morrison Pharmaceuticals officially expressed condolences, and even CEO Parker briefly appeared. "Such a tragic accident." "Dr. Hayes was an excellent researcher," Parker said to Margaret, performing hypocritical grief. Margaret nodded expressionlessly. All her emotions seemed exhausted from recent days. Ruth couldn't accept her son's death and kept crying. "I should have gone first. I should have gone first," she repeated. Emily tried to be strong, but her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale. For a 17-year-old girl, her father's sudden death was an unbearable shock. David's photo, surrounded by flowers, sat on the memorial altar. His smile in the picture felt increasingly ironic against the funeral home's heavy atmosphere. After the funeral ended and people left one by one, only Margaret, Emily, and Ruth remained. "How will we live now, Ruth?" Margaret asked, holding her mother-in-law's hand. Ruth answered only with tears. Emily quietly embraced her mother and grandmother. "Mom, Grandma, we'll get through this together. That's what Dad would want." Margaret looked at her daughter. Her heart ached seeing her so mature at such a young age. "You're right. That's what your father would want," Margaret replied in a weak voice. They bowed one last time to David's photograph and left the funeral home. But what they didn't know was that David was still alive. Somewhere in the mountains, he was fighting for survival. His left leg was clearly broken, and blood flowed from wounds all over his body. In the cold night air, he was gradually losing consciousness. "Honey, come look! Someone's collapsed here!" A faint female voice reached David's ears. He tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids were too heavy. "Oh my goodness, this is serious. He's badly hurt." With a male voice, David felt someone carefully lifting him. In excruciating pain, he groaned, but managed to squeeze out final words before passing out. "Please, don't call the police." When David regained consciousness, he didn't know how much time had passed. He found himself lying in an unfamiliar room. It was small and modest, but warm, and his body was covered with thick blankets. His left leg was secured with wooden boards, and his arms and head were wrapped in bandages. The door opened, and an elderly woman, who appeared to be in her 70s, entered. She looked surprised to see David awake. "Oh my, you're finally awake! George, come quickly!" An elderly man soon entered as well, looking at David with concern. "Young man, you're conscious. Would you like some water?" David barely managed to nod, and the woman carefully brought water to his lips. As the cool liquid went down his throat, his mind cleared a bit. "Where am I?" David asked. "Our home." "A small house in the mountains. We were taking a walk when we found you collapsed in the brush near the ravine." "You were badly injured," the woman explained. David tried to recall what had happened. "How long have I been here?" "4 days," the man replied. "You had a terrible fever. We almost lost you. My wife brought it down with home remedies. We tried to take you to a hospital, but you kept saying no, no, and waving us off." David was silent for a moment, then carefully spoke. "Someone tried to kill me." The elderly couple exchanged surprised looks, but the man nodded. "I see. There was news about your car exploding in the ravine. They said they were searching for a missing person." David was shocked. By now, everyone must think he's dead. Margaret, Emily, his mother, how devastated they must be. David fell into deep thought. If he let his family know he was alive, Morrison Pharmaceuticals would come after him again. And this time, his family might be in danger too. "I can't go back right now," David said slowly. "If people know I'm alive, my family will be in danger." The elderly couple looked at each other, and the man nodded. "You can stay here for now. You can't move until your leg heals anyway." "Thank you so much. I don't know how to repay this kindness," David said. "Don't mention it." The man waved his hand. "We have no children. Having you here actually brings us joy." And so David began slowly recovering under the elderly couple's care. During this time, he contemplated how he could get revenge on Morrison Pharmaceuticals and reclaim his life. One evening after dinner, David spoke. "I need to stay dead while I gather evidence." "That's a dangerous decision," the man said with concern. "When can you return to your family?" the woman asked. David thought for a moment. "Within 5 years, I must expose the truth and return to my family." The statute of limitations for concealing drug side effects is 5 years. Before that expires, I need to secure evidence and bring Morrison Pharmaceuticals to justice. 5 years is a long time, the elderly man sighed. "Yes, but for my family's sake, and for my own lost life, I have to endure it," David said. His eyes filled with determination. After that, David began preparing his new identity. He grew out his hair and beard and obtained fake identification. With a new name, Stephen Morrison, he spent several weeks at the elderly couple's house before he was ready to be independent. The couple gave David some of their savings, and with it, he rented a single room in a small town far from the city. "I will repay this kindness." David bowed deeply to the couple on the day he left. "Just knowing you're alive is joy enough for us," the woman said warmly. "Contact us anytime you need help. Our door is always open." David left them with tears of gratitude in his eyes. And so David Now Stephen Morrison began his real war against Morrison Pharmaceuticals. The fact that David Hayes was dead had actually become his weapon. Over the following months, David met with more than 10 victims of Cartostop. Some were preparing lawsuits against Morrison Pharmaceuticals, but most lacked solid evidence or were too intimidated by the company's enormous power. As David met more and more victims, he realized they needed a community where they could fight together. That's when he founded the Drug Victims Alliance. David built the foundation of the organization around several active victims. He didn't reveal his face publicly instead, Another car-to-stop victim, named Robert Chen, served as the official representative. They campaigned not just about car-to-stop, but also about other dangerous medications, and managed to get several smaller pharmaceutical companies to issue recalls. But David's primary target remained Morrison Pharmaceuticals and car-to-stop. Time passed, and as David led the Drug Victims Alliance and gathered evidence against Morrison Pharmaceuticals, the statute of limitations drew near. And now he'd met his wife again. Just a few more pieces of critical evidence, and I can bring that company to court. David's voice echoed through the small apartment where he now stood with Margaret. Margaret sat on the couch, hands clasped tightly, having listened to her husband's entire story. The initial shock of seeing him had faded, and now she was trying calmly to accept reality. Then suddenly, as if making a decision, she spoke. "David, I need to tell you something." David tensed at Margaret's serious expression. "What is it?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I've been working as a housekeeper at Richard Parker's home." David's face went pale. "Since when?" His voice trembled. "Not long after you died. Mr. Parker said he knew we'd be struggling without you and offered to help me find good work. It turned out to be a housekeeping position, and I've been doing it ever since. I clean his house 3 times a week." David jumped up from his seat. His face showed a mixture of fear and rage. "You need to quit immediately. That man is dangerous, Margaret." "He tried to have me killed." Margaret calmly shook her head. "No, now I understand. There was a reason he specifically hired me to work in his home." David suddenly had a realization. "Richard Parker deliberately hired you to keep watch on you." "Exactly," Margaret nodded. "I think Richard Parker suspects you might not be dead. They never found your body that day, so he's keeping me close to watch me." Margaret continued, "Sometimes Mr. Parker casually asks about you. 'Doesn't I miss my husband? Isn't it hard?' Such a tragic accident," he says. David's eyes widened. He went to the window and carefully looked outside. The alley was quiet, but he still looked anxious. "When you came here, was anyone following you?" David asked worriedly. "I don't know, but I didn't notice anyone suspicious." David breathed a sigh of relief, but still looked tense. "Use me," Margaret said gently. "I have free access to Mr. Parker's house." David looked at her in surprise. "What are you talking about? It's too dangerous." Margaret's voice was firm. "I might be able to find important evidence at Mr. Parker's house." David shook his head. "I can't put you in danger, Margaret." Margaret took both of David's hands. "I won't let you do this alone this time. We'll see it through together. And the statute of limitations is 5 years, right? There's not much time left. Let me help. Trust me." David looked into his wife's determined eyes. "All right. But instead of looking for direct evidence, focus on gathering information," David said carefully. "Observe Mr. Parker's daily routine, his visitors, phone conversations, and if possible, see if there's any discussion or documents about car-to-stop's side effects." Margaret nodded seriously. "I understand. And never act suspiciously. You have to behave like a normal housekeeper," David emphasized. "I understand. I'll be careful." David made thorough preparations for his wife's safety. "Don't come here again after today. Let's meet once a week at a safe location, briefly." Margaret nodded. "Okay." David looked at his wife. He was amazed by her courage and determination. "Thank you, Margaret." "Really?" Margaret smiled gently. "It's for our family, for Emily and Ruth, and for you." The two held hands tightly. After 5 years of separation, they were now beginning a dangerous fight for justice together. The next morning, Margaret went to work at Richard Parker's house as usual. When she arrived and rang the doorbell, James Bradford, Parker's assistant, opened the door. "Good morning," Bradford greeted her with a polite but cold voice. "Good morning, Mr. Bradford," Margaret responded courteously. "I'm here to clean." Mr. Parker left for a morning meeting. "I'm just stopping by to pick up some important documents." "Clean as usual. But don't clean Mr. Parker's study today." "Yes, understood." But she secretly planned to enter the study anyway. She knew there was a large safe in there and wanted to photograph it to show her husband. After Bradford gathered his papers and left, Margaret did her best to investigate various areas of the house. For a week, she passed information she'd collected at Parker's house to David. Parker's meeting schedule, photos of the safe, fragments of conversations about Morrison Pharmaceuticals' clinical trials. Among them, information about a litigation strategy meeting was particularly important. "They're probably keeping close tabs on our organization," David said. "Thanks. This will be very helpful. Take care of yourself." And so the two parted after their brief meeting. Then one day, the decisive moment arrived. Margaret was cleaning the living room at Parker's house. Parker and Bradford were talking on the balcony, and she carefully approached to eavesdrop on their conversation. "I'm keeping the documents about that accident in a safe place," Parker's voice said. "You're an accomplice too. Keep this secret. Otherwise, we're both finished." "I have no intention of talking, sir," Bradford replied nervously. "Don't worry. The documents are in my safe. No one can access them. As long as the two of us keep quiet, no one will know." Margaret heard the conversation and became certain that important documents were hidden in the safe. On the day she met with David, she immediately told him about it. "The safe," David muttered. "There's a high probability that documents about trying to kill me or covering up Cardistop's side effects are in there." "But we need the password to open the safe," Margaret said. David fell into thought. "I'll give you passwords to try. Morrison Pharmaceuticals' founding date, his wedding anniversary. I'll compile everything related to him and give it to you. When you get a chance, try them." Margaret nodded. "Okay." David paused thoughtfully. "But don't push too hard. If you're caught, it's dangerous." "I know. I'll be careful." Meanwhile, Parker sat in his office at Morrison Pharmaceuticals with a grim expression, staring at his computer screen. The Drug Victims Alliance homepage was open, showing their recent statement. Morrison Pharmaceuticals' heart medication, Cardistop, causes serious liver damage, and we have gathered evidence that the company knew about this and concealed it. This truth will soon be revealed to the world. Parker glared at the screen, clenching his fists. In recent weeks, the organization's activities had become increasingly and specifically targeted at Morrison Pharmaceuticals. Bradford knocked and entered the office. "Sir, I have the investigation results." "Go ahead," Parker said impatiently. "We've analyzed the Drug Victims Alliance's activities. Officially, a man named Robert Chen is registered as the representative, but the actual operations seem to be managed by an unidentified consultant." Parker stroked his chin, lost in thought. Then he suddenly stood up and walked to the window. "That accident 5 years ago, David Hayes's body was never found, was it?" Bradford's expression hardened. "That's correct, sir. Only the vehicle was found, and the interior was almost completely destroyed by fire. Legally, it's only presumed death." "Presumed," Parker repeated the word. "So there's a possibility he's alive." "But sir, that's nearly impossible, surviving that kind of crash. But this Drug Victims Alliance making trouble now, and if David Hayes is alive, doesn't it all connect a bit too conveniently?" Parker said coldly. He thought for a moment, then continued. Intensify surveillance on David Hayes's wife. When Margaret comes to our house next time, I'll stay close to her the whole time. Understood, sir. Bradford bowed his head. Then one day came. Margaret visited Parker's house, unaware she might be under suspicion. Though it was a cleaning day, Margaret had decided to attempt discovering the safe's password. But she didn't know then that this decision would bring great trouble. She rang the doorbell at the house entrance as usual. Bradford opened the door. He looked at Margaret with cold eyes. Come in. Margaret politely greeted him and entered the house. Parker wasn't home, and only she and Bradford remained in the apartment. Clean as usual. I'll be here the whole time, Bradford said, staring at Margaret. Yes, understood. She calmly responded and took out her cleaning supplies, starting with the living room as usual. Margaret repeated her routine actions, but her mind was entirely focused on the safe and the passwords her husband had given her. Margaret began dusting and cleaning the floor as usual. Her eyes naturally drifted toward the safe on the left wall. Then Bradford's cell phone rang. Yes, speaking, Bradford answered. This was her chance. While he was distracted by the call, Margaret began entering safe passwords one by one. Parker's wedding anniversary, no response. His daughter's birthday and mother's death date, no response. Then a combination of Morrison Pharmaceuticals' founding anniversary and Parker's birthday, 0525 0321. Finally, a small beep came from the safe, and the lock released. There was no time. She quickly opened the safe door. Inside were several folders and documents neatly organized. Since she didn't know what anything was, she just photographed everything with her phone. She had to work fast since Bradford could return to the room at any moment. Her breath caught, her heart pounded, cold sweat formed, but she did her best to photograph all the materials. Suddenly, the study door opened. It was Bradford, but Margaret had already finished photographing. Bradford watched Margaret for a while, then moved elsewhere. During that time, she sent David a quick message, opened the safe. I'll leave soon. After cleaning for an hour, Margaret said to Bradford, I'm done cleaning. I'll be going now. As she walked toward the front door, Bradford suddenly blocked her path. Wait a moment. May I see your phone? Margaret felt her heart stop in shock, but outwardly she only showed surprise. My phone? Why? Mr. Parker's orders, Bradford said coldly. That's my private property, Margaret protested. Bradford's eyes narrowed. Please show me your phone. Margaret was seized with fear. Her phone contained all the evidence photos she'd just taken. If she showed her phone now, everything would be over. I'm really sorry, but I can't do that. My personal phone has private content on it, Margaret said firmly. Tense energy flowed between them. Then Bradford began approaching Margaret, as if he would use force to take the phone. Margaret's heart was already pounding fit to burst. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Excuse me, delivery! Someone called from outside the door. The doorbell kept ringing, and Bradford walked toward the door with an annoyed expression. In that brief moment when he turned away, Margaret quickly took out her phone and sent all the photos to David. Then she deleted all the pictures. Bradford opened the entrance and checked, but no one was there. He returned to Margaret with a puzzled expression and a shake of his head. Show me your phone. Margaret reluctantly took out her phone. If it's really necessary, I'll show you. But this is a privacy violation, and you're making a mistake. Bradford took her phone and opened the gallery. There were only family photos and everyday pictures, no suspicious photos. He reluctantly returned the phone. From now on, if you want to continue working here, You'll need to submit to a photo check every time you leave. Understand? You may go now. Bradford reluctantly stepped aside. Then I'll be leaving. Margaret greeted him and walked toward the front door. Even as she opened the door and left, she could feel Bradford's sharp gaze on her back. But she maintained a calm appearance. As soon as she got on the elevator, Margaret let out a deep breath. Her legs were shaking, and her heart was still racing fast. But she'd done it. She'd secured critical evidence. A text came from David. Meet me at Building 2 playground next to the office complex. When she got to the playground, David was waiting for her. I got the photos, David said quietly. Actually, the moment you texted that you'd open the safe, I immediately headed to Parker's house. I was worried about you. I watched until you came out safely. I was the one who rang the doorbell. You were taking too long to come out, so I rang it to check if something was wrong. Were you okay? Margaret nodded. She wanted to say so much, but at this moment, her body had no strength left. David smiled. Thank you. All the photos are clear. This is decisive evidence. That's a relief. Margaret sighed with relief. David lightly squeezed her hand. Let's get out of here quickly. The two quickly left the park and headed to a nearby subway station. The next morning, David and Margaret met at a cafe near their house. David sent a message to the most trustworthy prosecutor he knew, with a brief explanation, and all the evidence he'd gathered over the years attached, requesting a meeting. We've done everything we needed to do. This should be enough. Now let's go back to our family, David said. They no longer needed to hide. They walked confidently, without fear. When they arrived in front of Margaret's apartment, David paused. His chest swelled, thinking about seeing his family again after 5 years. Are you ready? Margaret asked. David took a deep breath and nodded. Yes. I'm ready. Opening the front door and entering, Ruth, who had been watching TV in the living room, turned her head. She first looked puzzled at the man who'd entered with Margaret. Then, as she recognized her son's features, hidden behind the beard and glasses, her eyes gradually widened. David? Ruth's voice trembled. Mother? David couldn't say anything more. Ruth tried to stand up, but seemed to lose strength in her legs. David quickly approached and supported his mother. Mother, I've come home. I'm so sorry. David's voice broke. Ruth cupped her son's face with both hands, tears streaming down. Is this a dream? Is it really my son? It's me, Mother. I'm alive. At that moment, the bedroom door opened and Emily emerged. She stopped when she saw the scene in the living room. Mom, Grandma, what's happening? Emily's gaze turned to David. At first, she had a guarded expression toward a stranger, but gradually, something seemed to dawn on her. Emily! David took a step toward his daughter. Emily's eyes widened. Her mouth opened slightly, and her hands began trembling. Dad? David nodded. Yes, Emily. It's Dad. Emily stood for a moment with an expression of disbelief, then suddenly ran and hugged David tightly. Dad, it's really you. How? How is this possible? David held his daughter and sobbed. The last time he'd seen Emily, she was in high school. Now she'd become a poised college student, and the time he'd missed would never return. I'm sorry, Emily. I'm so sorry, David repeatedly said, patting his daughter's back. Margaret watched the scene with tears flowing. Finally, their family was whole again. After 5 years of separation, they could now start over. That night, David confessed the whole truth to his family, discovering Cardistop's dangers at Morrison Pharmaceuticals, the company's cover-up attempts, the plot to kill him, and the story of living as Stephen Morrison for 5 years. His family listened to his story with shock anger, and relief. "It's going to end now," David said. "We've secured all the evidence and turned it over to the prosecutor. Richard Parker and Morrison Pharmaceuticals will face justice." As soon as he finished speaking, David's phone rang. It was the prosecutor. "I've reviewed the materials you sent. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning at 9? We'll take your official statement and begin the investigation." David breathed a sigh of relief. "Yes, I'll be there. Thank you." Hanging up, David looked at his family. "The official investigation starts tomorrow." Margaret squeezed his hand tightly. "It's really ending now." David held his wife's hand in return and nodded. "Yes, everything's ending now. Our family can be together again." The two shared a warm embrace, and Emily and Ruth also embraced them. Their eyes now shone with the light of hope, not fear. 3 months later, newspapers and news broadcasts began reporting the Morrison Pharmaceuticals scandal. The documents Margaret had photographed, combined with the evidence David had collected over 5 years, were submitted to the prosecutor and developed into a major scandal. Morrison Pharmaceuticals CEO Richard Parker arrested. Morrison Pharmaceuticals stock plummets 70%. Investors prepare class action lawsuit. Cardistop recalled worldwide. The news screen showed Parker in handcuffs entering the prosecutor's office. His once arrogant expression was now filled with fear and despair. David legally restored his identity, and his death certificate was canceled. One evening, David and Margaret sat in a cafe overlooking the river. "It was a long journey," David said, looking out the window. "Yes," Margaret replied, "but we did it. Together." David took Margaret's hand. Margaret smiled. "Our family is whole again." David nodded. "Emily makes me so proud. Applying to medical school, she takes after her father." "She takes after you?" Margaret laughed. The two looked at each other in silence for a moment. Their eyes no longer held fear or sadness. Only love and hope filled them. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. David thought for a moment, then answered, "I don't know. But as long as we're together, we can handle anything." He squeezed his wife's hand tightly, and Margaret squeezed back. An uncertain future stretched before them, but they were no longer alone. With family and relying on each other, they could overcome any difficulty. Outside the window, the sunset was painting the river. One day was ending, and another was about to begin. For David and Margaret, too, 5 years of darkness had ended, and a hopeful new beginning awaited. "Let's go home," David said, standing up. "Our family is waiting." Margaret smiled and nodded. "Yes, let's go home, where our family is." The two walked out of the cafe hand in hand. Behind them, the river's sunset shone beautifully, as if foretelling their bright future.